Welcome to Legends of Humanity, the international history storytelling channel that brings to life the journeys of great individuals who changed the world. In today's episode, we dive into the life of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, guardian of the Union, and an eternal symbol of justice, compassion, and democratic leadership. From a humble log cabin in the wilderness to a self-taught lawyer defending the powerless, and ultimately to the highest office in the land during its darkest hour, Lincoln didn't just save a nation, he left behind a moral legacy that continues to inspire the world. A log cabin in the wilderness on a cold winter morning, February 12, 1809, in the remote frontier settlement of Hodgenville, Kentucky, a boy was born in a one-room log cabin, barely 30 square meters wide. Few could have imagined that this child born to a poor farming family would one day become the greatest symbol of justice and leadership in American history. His name was Abraham Lincoln. His family had no windows, no books, no money. Everything in their cabin was built by hand. His parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, were illiterate laborers sustained by hard work and hope, carving a life out of wilderness and hardship. When Abraham was just 2 years old, the family moved to Indiana in search of a better future. There, he grew up surrounded by mud, trees, axes, and isolation. There were no schools, no libraries, no friends nearby, only the howling winds of the forest and the distant promise of a world beyond. Tragedy struck when Abraham was 9. His mother died suddenly, leaving a void in the small cabin and an ache in the heart of a quiet, thoughtful boy. With no formal funeral, no pastor, and no proper coffin, he crafted a wooden grave marker himself and silently began carrying a grief that would shape the depth of his soul. Soon after, his father remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. Contrary to Lincoln's fears, Sarah became a loving stepmother, treating Abraham as her own and encouraging his hunger for knowledge. She saw in him something rare, and she nurtured it with patience and care. Abraham began learning to read using a borrowed Bible. He wrote letters in fireplace, soot, and practiced arithmetic with chalk on wooden planks. With only a handful of formal lessons, he became almost entirely self-taught, reading wherever and whenever he could in a log, in a barn, by the fire, or under the stars. People would speak of the tall, awkward boy who would walk miles, sometimes over 20 miles on foot, just to borrow a book. He would read all night by candlelight, then return the book the next day, grateful beyond measure. Despite his rough beginnings, Lincoln developed a sharp mind and an astonishing command of language. He devoured Aesop's fables, Shakespeare's plays, and speeches on liberty and justice. He didn't just read, he memorized, analyzed, and practiced retelling them, developing the voice that one day would move nations. Outside the cabin, he worked tirelessly, splitting logs, plowing fields, building fences, ferrying cargo, guiding flatboats on the Ohio River. No job was beneath him. Though thin and tall, he earned the respect of neighbors for his honesty, humility, and work ethic. It was in these harsh formative years that Lincoln's core values took root: truth, dignity, fairness, and perseverance. No preacher instilled these in him. They came from pain, solitude, and the wisdom found between the pages of worn-out books. And every night, in the stillness of the wilderness, one might glimpse a flickering fire inside a log cabin, and a boy with hollow cheeks and shining eyes, hunched over a torn book, lips moving silently in the dark. That boy's dreams, fueled by sorrow, firelight, and relentless will, would one day step out of the forest, enter the courtroom, rise to the White House, and leave footprints in the soil of human history. The boy who walked 20 miles for a book, while other children played by the creek or hunted squirrels in the woods, Abraham Lincoln, tall, thin, and quiet, spent every spare moment with a book in hand. In a world without electricity, libraries, or structured schools, books were his only windows to the wider world. But in the American frontier of the early 1800s, books were as rare as gold. In the entire village where he lived, few owned more than a handful of books. There were no libraries, no bookstores, and certainly no money to buy books in a family as poor as his. Still, Lincoln refused to give up. He sought out anyone rumored to own books preachers, teachers, traders, neighbors, torn pages, missing covers, printing errors. It didn't matter. If it had words, he would read it. One story would become legend. Upon hearing that a man living nearly 20 miles away owned a biography of George Washington, young Abraham rose before dawn and walked all day through forests, across hills, and over creeks just to borrow it. By the time he arrived, his feet were blistered and his shirt soaked with sweat, but his eyes glowed with determination. The man, moved by the boy's devotion, not only lent him the book, but gave him two more. Back home, Lincoln read deep into the night by the dim glow of the hearth, often sitting on a barrel, back against a log wall, bare feet stretched toward the fading coals. He devoured every word, not as a student studying for a test, but as a soul thirsting for freedom. He would copy passages by hand, recite them aloud, and try to retell them in his own words. Each book was a new adventure, a conversation with minds long gone but eternally alive on the page. Aesop, Shakespeare, the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe. These were not just stories. They were the scaffolding of his moral and intellectual foundation. Though surrounded by poverty, Abraham never allowed his circumstances to define his mind. He once said, "I will learn whatever it takes. If no one will teach me, I will teach myself." And he did. With no formal classroom, he turned trees into teachers. With no blackboard, he wrote in dirt with sticks. With no mentors, he debated with himself, asking, answering, questioning, and reflecting. Neighbors began to notice. He wasn't just a hard-working boy. He was that odd Abe, the kid who spoke like a grown man, read like a scholar, and thought like a philosopher in a homespun shirt. Though often teased for his awkward looks and quiet demeanor, Lincoln never lashed out. He simply smiled and returned to his reading. That composure paired with his kindness and relentless drive earned the respect of adults, who began asking him to write letters, interpret contracts, and even settle disputes. In a land ruled by hardship and ignorance, one light flickered gently in a modest log cabin, light of a mind awakening to its purpose. Abraham Lincoln, the boy who walked 20 miles for a single book, would one day walk into courtrooms, into debates, into battlefields, and into history. But it all began here with bare feet, blistered soles, and a fire in his heart to learn. Because sometimes, the greatest revolutions start not with armies, but with a boy holding a borrowed book. The people's lawyer, if Abraham Lincoln had been raised by the glow of firelight and the wisdom of books, then his early adulthood was shaped in the crucible of law and justice where honesty, empathy, and intellect were tested, not in classrooms, but in dusty courtrooms and under open skies. After working a series of modest jobs, rail splitter, flat boatman, store clerk, and volunteering in the Black Hawk War, Lincoln began studying law in the state of Illinois. He had no formal legal education. Instead, he borrowed law books, studied alone, and passed the bar exam through sheer self-discipline. By the time he was not yet 30, he was officially a licensed attorney. At the time, America was still young and rough, and justice often belonged to those with money and influence. But Lincoln, dressed in coarse clothes and wearing a worn black hat, chose a different path. He became a lawyer for those who had nothing but the truth on their side. He traveled across central Illinois on horseback, following a rotating circuit of judges through mud, snow, and prairie grass, hauling his books in a saddlebag and sleeping in modest inns or barns. Farmers, widows, orphans, and small tradesmen turned to him not because he was flashy, but because he listened. Many of his cases he took for free. Sometimes, instead of accepting a fee, he asked only for a meal or a handshake. On at least one occasion, upon realizing that his client had lied, he returned the entire payment and withdrew from the case, saying simply, "I am a lawyer, not a trickster of words." In one of his most famous early cases, he saved a man from the gallows by noticing a detail others missed. The witness claimed to have seen the crime by moonlight, but Lincoln proved that the moon hadn't risen yet. That simple observation paired with his belief in the man's innocence became legendary in American legal circles. Lincoln was never aggressive in court, but his arguments were sharp, heartfelt, and deeply human. He often used stories and parables borrowing from fables and frontier folklore to make his points accessible and memorable. For him, the law was not a game of intellect, but a shield for the vulnerable. Fellow lawyers called him Honest Abe, not as a nickname, but as a truth. They had seen him reject bribes, expose corruption, and defend the helpless, even when it meant losing. His success was not in winning every case, but in earning the unwavering trust of the people. When he entered a courtroom, even those who disagreed with him knew that he stood for fairness, not favors. In an era when justice could be bought and sold, Abraham Lincoln, the people's lawyer, reminded the world what law was meant to be: a servant of truth, a refuge for the weak, and a quiet fire of integrity in a darkening age. And it was in these quiet, uncelebrated year-sawn country roads and in makeshift courthouses that a leader began to take form, not through ambition, but through trust. The giant of conscience in the mid-19th century, the United States stood at the brink of a moral reckoning. While the North moved toward industry, modernity, and abolitionist ideals, the South clung tightly to slavery as an economic and cultural pillar. Millions of black men, women, and children were bought and sold, beaten, silenced, and treated as property, and the Constitution, as it stood, did little to stop it. Into this storm of silence and self-interest stepped a quiet figure with a resolute voice, Abraham Lincoln, the humble lawyer of the people, now ready to enter the world of politics. He brought with him not ambition, but a soul shaped by books and a conscience stirred by injustice. Lincoln was elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1834 and later to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846. Among the halls of power, where compromise and convenience often ruled, Lincoln raised a question that few dared to utter. Can a nation truly endure if it is half slave and half free? He was not a fiery speaker. He did not shout or accuse, but when he rose to speak, his clarity pierced the noise. He did not demonize the South, but neither did he excuse evil. He refused to dress injustice in legal robes and insisted that a constitution meant to protect liberty could not eternally shelter slavery. In a now famous speech at Peoria in 1854, Lincoln declared, "If slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." For him, the issue was not merely legal, it was profoundly moral. A nation founded upon the declaration that all men are created equal could not live in peace while denying that truth in practice. To oppose slavery at that time was to invite backlash, scorn, and political ruin. Many politicians avoided the topic. Others made peace with it. But Lincoln, never a radical, never a revolutionary, quietly became a towering conscience in the midst of moral collapse. He did not call for violence. He did not demand vengeance. He only stood calmly, firmly, with one unshakable truth. Human beings cannot be owned. As the Kansas-Nebraska Act ignited a national firestorm threatening to spread slavery into new Western territories, Lincoln could no longer remain on the sidelines. He re-entered the political arena and warned, if this act becomes law, then the spirit of America is lost. To the people of the North, he was no longer merely a lawyer or former congressman. He had become a quiet symbol of moral courage, a man unafraid of being unpopular, who feared only the silence of good men. From the wilds of Kentucky and the fields of Illinois, a figure was rising not through military conquest or oratory spectacle, but by the unyielding power of awakened conscience. The legendary debates with Douglas in 1858, the eyes of an anxious nation turned to the state of Illinois. Two men, Stephen A. Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, were campaigning for the U.S. Senate. What followed was a historic confrontation. 7 open-air debates across small towns, drawing crowds in the tens of thousands and igniting fierce national interest. Douglas was a political titan, nicknamed the Little Giant, a seasoned senator and master orator. Lincoln, by contrast, seemed an outsider, tall, awkward, dressed in worn clothes, still known more as a small-town lawyer than a political force. But those who had heard Lincoln speak knew better. When he rose to address the crowd, words became not weapons but awakenings. At the heart of these debates was the burning question, slavery. Douglas defended the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed each new territory to vote on whether to allow slavery, a doctrine he called popular sovereignty. Lincoln, however, stood in stark opposition. To him, if slavery was wrong, no vote could make it right. At the Freeport debate, Lincoln pressed, "You say the people of a territory have the right to choose slavery or freedom. I ask, does that right include one man owning another? Is that freedom or the death of it?" Lincoln spoke not just with logic, but with moral clarity. He did not attack Douglas personally, but every sentence he spoke was a quiet thunderclap of challenge to the conscience of a divided nation. Freedom, Lincoln insisted, could not be redefined by geography or majority rule, because human dignity is universal. Douglas ultimately won the Senate seat thanks to an electoral system based on district votes, not popular ones. But Lincoln won something deeper: the attention of a nation, the respect of the press, and the awakening of a public desperate for conviction. As one reporter from the New York Tribune wrote, "Douglas speaks for the present, Lincoln speaks for the future." After the debates, Lincoln's name spread across the country. Newspapers praised his eloquence, while citizens across the North began calling him the conscience of the nation. He did not stir hatred. He made no empty promises. He simply told the truth, and in doing so, shook the very foundations of a fragile democracy. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were not just a contest between two politicians. They were a national moral test, a defining moment in America's reckoning with its own ideals. And from the wooden platforms of humble towns, Abraham Lincoln emerged not merely as a candidate, but as a guardian of freedom, carrying the voice of justice into the heart of the Republic. The road to the White House by 1860, the United States was no longer a united nation. It was a country split in two by fear and fury. Slavery had evolved from a moral dilemma and economic debate into a fracture line threatening to break the nation apart. In the South, slavery was the lifeblood of agriculture, and many warned that if a president opposed to the institution were elected, secession would follow. The North itself was torn between those who sought compromise and those who demanded an end to injustice. Into this boiling landscape stepped a man with no elite pedigree, no national office, no wealth: Abraham Lincoln. He was not nominated because of his fame or fortune, but because he was uniquely steady, humble enough to unify, and principled enough not to surrender. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, amid roaring delegates, political giants, and backroom deals, Lincoln, tall, gaunt, and quiet-eyed, emerged as the party's presidential nominee. In his acceptance remarks, he said simply, "I accept this responsibility not for myself, but for the country, and I shall not betray the hopes of its people." His campaign was unconventional. Rather than tour the country giving speeches, Lincoln stayed in Springfield, welcoming visitors and writing letters, hundreds of them laying out his vision for the nation. His voice spread through newspapers, surrogates, and word of mouth. He did not preach revolution. He stated calmly, "I do not seek to abolish slavery by force, but I believe this nation cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free." Southern leaders exploded in fury, threatening to secede if Lincoln won. They painted him as a radical, an enemy of their way of life. But in the factories and farms of the North, among laborers, teachers, and housewives, Lincoln's quiet strength inspired something rare: trust. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He did not win with machinery or charisma, but with the quiet momentum of moral conviction, the belief that someone who once split rails and read by candlelight could now carry a fragile nation on his shoulders. But his election brought no peace. Almost immediately, Southern states began planning secession. The Union was unraveling before he had even taken office. And so, as Lincoln walked toward the White House, he did not step onto a red carpet, stepped into a firestorm. From that moment on, the man born in a log cabin, who once walked 20 miles to borrow a book, became the moral and political soul of a country fighting to survive itself. President in a storm of fire on March 4, 1861. Beneath a gray sky and amid an atmosphere heavy with dread, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office as the 16th President of the United States. He stood on the inaugural platform in Washington, D.C., wind brushing through his worn black suit, his solemn gaze cast across a divided crowd. There were no cheers, only a silence thick with uncertainty, silence of a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. Within mere months of his election, 7 southern states had declared secession, forming the Confederate States of America with their own capital in Richmond, Virginia. They had a new constitution, a new flag, and their own president, Jefferson Davis. Lincoln understood what few dared say aloud. He was no longer president of a united country. He was a man tasked with holding together the crumbling remains of a fragile union. In his first inaugural address, he chose neither accusation nor aggression. Instead, he appealed to the common heart. We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. But even as he spoke those words, those bonds were snapping. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. Soon, 4 more states joined the rebellion. The Union's army was unprepared, understaffed, disorganized, and uncertain. And Lincoln, a man with no military background, no formal command experience, became commander-in-chief in the bloodiest conflict in American history. He moved quickly, calling for volunteers, strengthening forts, reorganizing the War Department. Yet behind the executive orders and proclamations, he bore the heaviest burden of all, holding a fractured nation together with sheer will and moral clarity. There were nights when he did not sleep. He would wander the White House halls, weary and alone, burdened by decisions that would cost thousands of lives. Yet, still, he stood. Even as newspapers turned against him, generals failed him, and cabinet members doubted him, Lincoln held fast to one guiding star. The Union must not perish. In a private letter to a friend, he confided, "I may not be the president they admire, but if I can save the Constitution, preserve the Union, and defend what is right, then the solitude will be worth it." Lincoln was not just a wartime president. He was the heartbeat of a nation in crisis, a steady voice amid cannon fire and chaos. In a war that turned brother against brother, he refused to hate. In a capital besieged by division, he clung to hope. He did not raise his fist in triumph, but extended his hand in reconciliation, even when the flames rose higher around him. From the moment he entered the White House, Abraham Lincoln became more than a man. He became the enduring soul of democracy, tested in fire, tempered in resolve, and unyielding in purpose. The proclamation that changed history in the early years of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln held fast to one priority: preserving the Union. He knew that raising the issue of slavery too soon might drive the border states into the arms of the Confederacy, potentially shattering the Union beyond repair. But as the war dragged on through bloody fields, broken homes, and bitter divides, Lincoln saw something deeper. Thousands of black men volunteered to fight for a country that still denied their humanity. And he came to understand this war could not be won without also fighting for justice. Quietly, behind closed doors, Lincoln began drafting the words that would forever alter the course of American history. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a bold warning, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that if the rebellious states did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, all slaves in those states would be declared free. Many were shocked. Critics called it political theater. Supporters feared it didn't go far enough. But Lincoln stood firm. "I do this," he said, "not for politics, but because it is the right thing to do." On January 1, 1863, in the study of the White House, Abraham Lincoln sat at his desk. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from hours of New Year's handshakes with well-wishers. He paused, then said, "If my hand shakes, people will say I hesitated. I do not. Let me rest a moment." After a short break, he returned to his desk, steadied his hand, and with a clear, deliberate stroke, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. From that moment forward, more than 3 million enslaved people in the Confederate States were declared free. It did not free all slaves immediately. Border states and loyal slaveholding areas were exempt, but it transformed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just a battle for the Union. It had become a crusade for freedom. Lincoln wrote, "We cannot pray to the God of freedom while we deny freedom to others." The proclamation also opened the door for tens of thousands of Black Americans to join the Union Army. No longer property, they became soldiers fighting not just for a flag, but for their very existence. The world took notice. European governments reconsidered their sympathies for the Confederacy. The United States, bruised, bleeding, and battered, stood upright for the first time as a nation with a conscience. For Lincoln, it was not a political victory. It was a moral awakening, a liberation not only of people, but of the nation's soul. From that day forward, no one would call him just another politician. He was now the president of freedom, the man who declared that no human being was born to be owned. Gettysburg, 272 words that shook the world on November 19, 1863. A memorial ceremony was held in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, at the site of the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. Just 4 months earlier, over 50 Zero soldiers had fallen in a 3-day clash that turned rolling hills into graves. The air still carried the scent of gunpowder. The ground was still raw with fresh burials, and the nation was still reeling from a scale of loss it had never imagined. A national cemetery was being consecrated to honor the fallen. The keynote speaker was Edward Everett, a famed orator and scholar, who delivered a 2-hour speech, rich with history and rhetorical flourish. Abraham Lincoln was invited only to offer a few appropriate remarks. No one expected anything significant. He arrived modestly, without fanfare, wearing a simple black suit. In his pocket were just a few folded pages, quiet words on fragile paper. When Lincoln rose to speak, the crowd fell silent, not out of anticipation, but curiosity. What could a president say while the nation bled? Then he began, softly, slowly, and with the weight of history in every word. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He did not speak of military triumph. He did not attack the enemy. Instead, he spoke of ideals that the sacrifice made on those fields would be in vain if the nation failed to live up to its founding creed. With just 272 words in under 2 minutes, Lincoln reignited the American spirit. He said, "The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." And then came the final lines of call that still echoes today, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. There was a pause. No immediate applause. Some didn't even realize he had finished. But Everett, the master orator, later said to Lincoln, "Sir, you said in 2 minutes what I tried to say in 2 hours." Southern newspapers mocked it. Some northern papers were unsure, but the world remembered. The Gettysburg Address, the shortest speech in U.S. presidential history, became a second American founding, reaffirming the moral vision first declared in 1776. It was not just a eulogy for the dead. It was a wake-up call for the living. Not just a speech, but a flame of truth that still burns in the soul of a nation. The pain of war and the heart of compassion by 1863. The American Civil War had reached its most brutal phase. Battles raged from Virginia to Tennessee. Hundreds of thousands had died. Millions were grieving. And with each passing day, the name Abraham Lincoln appeared on more letters from the front, more tombstones, more whispered prayers, some pleading with him, some blaming him. To the public, he was the president. To himself, Lincoln felt like a father watching his own children destroy one another. He often paced the halls of the White House late into the night, silently reading casualty reports or writing personal notes to grieving families. When a mother who had lost 3 sons accused him of sacrificing her children to politics, Lincoln wrote back by hand, "I cannot make your grief lighter. I can only share in it. And I pray that their sacrifice will not be in vain." But it wasn't only loss that weighed on him, it was the growing hatred tearing the country apart. The North hated the South. Whites hated blacks. Soldiers hated the cause they had once marched for. Anger had replaced sorrow, and vengeance was seeping into every wound. And yet, Lincoln never gave in to bitterness. He still referred to the Confederates as our Southern brethren. He ordered newspapers to avoid inflammatory language. He forbade the Union Army from retaliating against civilians. When one general proposed burning an entire Southern town to set an example, Lincoln refused. He replied, "We are not merely fighting to win. We are fighting to be worthy of victory." Then came a personal blow deeper than politics or battle. Lincoln's beloved son, Willie, died of typhoid fever at age 11. The president was devastated. For weeks, he withdrew from meetings, refused meals, and rarely spoke. A White House aide once found him alone, staring at a portrait of Willie, whispering, "I can keep the soul of the Union, but I could not keep my boy." But even through this grief, Lincoln rose again not for himself, but for the millions who still looked to him for hope. He began to speak more often of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of healing the nation's wounds, not just through law, but through kindness. Critics called him weak, soft, even naive, but Lincoln believed one thing above all: compassion is the only foundation strong enough to rebuild a broken country. When asked what he would do with the South after the war, Lincoln answered, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Amid gunfire and bloodshed, Lincoln carried a quiet flame not of anger, but of humanity. And in the darkest chapter of American history, that small, steady fire became the true light of leadership, not forged in conquest, but in enduring compassion. Rebuilding a nation by 1864, the Civil War had begun to tilt in favor of the Union. After years of devastating losses, Northern armies were finally reclaiming territory and hope. But even before the final cannon was fired, Abraham Lincoln was already preparing for a far greater challenge: not winning the war, but healing a broken nation. He understood a simple truth: guns can end battles, but only compassion can end hatred. Many in his cabinet urged harsh punishment for the South. Some demanded executions, mass disenfranchisement, or military rule. But Lincoln, with quiet firmness, replied, "If we sow vengeance today, our children will reap blood tomorrow." As he campaigned for re-election in 1864, while war still raged, he chose not a slogan of victory or revenge, but one of mercy. With malice toward none, with charity for all, some mocked him for dreaming. But Lincoln believed that a republic cannot survive if built on bitterness. On March 4, 1865, as he took the oath for his second term, Lincoln delivered one of the most profound speeches in American history, not filled with triumph, but with humility and grace. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are into, bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. No boasting, no condemnation, just a blueprint for peace, built on the foundations of forgiveness and shared humanity. Lincoln then turned to Reconstruction, not as a conqueror, but as a healer. He proposed amnesty for those willing to pledge loyalty to the Union. He rejected sweeping punishment, and he insisted, forgiveness is a greater weapon than any sword. Not everyone agreed. Many Northern generals were furious. Radical politicians demanded retribution, but Lincoln chose what was right over what was easy. To the newly freed Black Americans, Lincoln offered not just freedom, but a vision of full citizenship with rights, dignity, and a place in the future of the Republic. In those final weeks of his life, he did not rest. He wrote letters, met with advisors, listened to the grief and hope of citizens from both sides. Observers noted his face had aged. His hair was whiter, his gaze more distant, but he never complained. Because for Lincoln, each day was a gift-hand opportunity to stitch together the torn fabric of a wounded nation. And so, the man who had led America through its darkest war was now becoming the quiet architect of its rebirth, not through victory parades, but through the quiet, unwavering labor of reconciliation. Re-elected and burdened with peace in the autumn of 1864, as cannon fire still thundered across battlefields, America held a presidential election in the midst of war, a remarkable testament to democracy under siege. While blood stained the soil of the South and hope flickered in the North, Abraham Lincoln once again stood for election not to preserve his presidency, but to preserve the nation. No one thought he would win. The war was long and punishing. The people were weary. The Democratic Party nominated former Union General George McClellan, who campaigned on a platform of peace negotiations. Even some of Lincoln's allies urged him to step down for the good of his legacy. But he replied, "If I must lose this election so that the Union may win, then I accept defeat." Then came a turning point. In September 1864, General Sherman captured Atlanta, restoring public confidence in a Union victory. In November, Lincoln won re-election by a decisive margin over 55% of the popular vote and an overwhelming majority of the Electoral College. There were no grand celebrations. When congratulated, Lincoln simply said, "This election was not about me. It was about the soul of America." Immediately, he turned back to the work ahead, preparing the country for peace. He knew the war would soon end. But true peace, the healing of a shattered Union, would take generations. Lincoln formed commissions to study how to rebuild the South, its economy, its schools, its courts. He insisted that freed Black Americans must be given full citizenship, not just freedom, but the right to vote, to learn, to live with dignity. He began planning the reintegration of the seceded states not as conquered foes, but as estranged brothers returning home. Some said he was too soft, but Lincoln believed there is no lasting peace if we leave any American behind its door. In early 1865, Lincoln worked relentlessly. He drafted speeches, met with leaders, listened to former soldiers and citizens. His second inaugural address was brief but immortal. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. That same year, under his leadership, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, permanently abolishing slavery in the United States. Lincoln did not rejoice. He wept. Over 600 men had died for this moment, for a promise finally written into law. For him, re-election was not triumph. It was a heavier burden, the responsibility to guide a broken country towards something it had never been, whole, just, and free. A reporter once asked if he hoped to rest after the war ended. Lincoln smiled faintly and replied, "I will rest when America can sleep in peace." And so, he continued. He met the public, heard their grief, drafted plans for reconciliation, and carried the weight of a wounded nation not with fanfare, but with quiet purpose. Abraham Lincoln, once a wartime president, now stood as the reluctant architect of peace not born from treaties, but from the steady heart of a man who believed true peace is not the absence of war, it is the beginning of something new. The bullet at Ford's Theater on the evening of April 14, 1865, Washington, D.C. sparkled with celebration. Fireworks filled the sky. Just 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, marking the end of the American Civil War. Crowds danced in the streets, singing, laughing, weeping with joy. For the first time in years, the nation could finally breathe without the sound of gunfire. Inside the White House, Abraham Lincoln sat quietly by a window. He did not sing, he did not celebrate. When asked why he wasn't delivering a victory speech, he replied, "I cannot speak of triumph while Southern homes still burn, while blood has yet to dry." But to honor his wife Mary Todd and the wishes of close friends, he agreed to attend a play that evening at Ford's Theater, Our American Cousin. After all he had endured, it seemed only fair for the president to enjoy one night of rest. But history had written a different script. When Lincoln entered the theater, the audience rose in applause. Some wept. He bowed gently, smiling, his eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond. During the second act, a man slipped through the backstage shadows. His name was John Wilkes, Booth, a well-known actor and Southern sympathizer. Fueled by rage, Booth believed killing Lincoln would avenge the South. Around 10:30 p.m., as the audience laughed at a line from the play, Booth quietly entered the presidential box unchallenged, known to the staff. He raised a small pistol, aimed at the back of Lincoln's head, and pulled the trigger. The bullet didn't just kill a man. It shattered the heart of a nation just beginning to heal. Lincoln did not cry out. He did not collapse. He simply tilted forward, as though drifting into a gentle sleep. Panic erupted. Booth leapt onto the stage, shouting in Latin, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He fled into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a small boarding house. The room was so narrow, they had to lay him diagonally on the bed. All night, doctors tried to save him, but the bullet had shattered his skull. They could do nothing. Witnesses later said that in those final hours, his face was peaceful, as though he knew his work was done. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln died. He was the first American president to be assassinated, and he died just as the nation was rising from its ashes. No cannons, no trumpets, just a silence deeper than any war had ever created. In northern cities, church bells rang endlessly. Even in the South, where many once reviled him, people bowed their heads. Across the world, millions mourned. European papers called him the martyr of democracy. From that moment on, Abraham Lincoln was no longer just a president. He became an eternal symbol of justice, compassion, and hope even in death. A nation in mourning on. The morning of April 15, 1865, at exactly 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln took his final breath, and with him, an entire nation collapsed into unspeakable grief. Church bells tolled from Philadelphia to Boston. Headlines pierced the hearts of millions. The president is dead. The savior of the Union has fallen. One man for an entire people. In Washington, black cloth draped over windows, lampposts, and domes. Crowds lined the streets for miles, waiting to pass his coffin, to weep before the casket of a man they had never met but felt they had known all their lives. The official funeral took place on April 19, 1865, at the White House. A simple walnut coffin, draped in the American flag, surrounded by white flowers and solemn guards. There were no long speeches, no triumphant music, just silence, reverence, and mourning exactly as Lincoln would have wanted. Then began one of the most extraordinary funeral journeys in history, nearly 700 miles across 13 major cities over 20 days. Lincoln's funeral train, bound for Springfield, Illinois, retraced the path he once traveled toward the presidency, but now in reverse, carrying his body home. At every stop, hundreds of thousands gathered. Some climbed rooftops. Some stood all night in the rain. In one town, mothers held up their children and whispered, "Look carefully. This is the man who gave you your freedom." Black Americans wept openly. Soldiers removed their hats and placed hands over their hearts. Even former Confederate supporters bowed their heads in respect. Around the world, condolences poured in. In England, Parliament stood in mourning. In France, churches hung portraits of Lincoln beneath the words, "He died for liberty. He lives in justice." On May 4, 1865, the train reached Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, the quiet town where Lincoln once lived a humble life before becoming a giant of history. As a soft spring rain fell, Illinois citizens gathered not as spectators, but as mourners, not out of duty, but out of love. There were no shouted slogans. No cannons fired, just the sound of April rain in tears. They carved into his tomb the words, "Abraham Lincoln, he belongs to the ages." And truly, from that moment on, Lincoln no longer belonged to America alone. He became a global symbol of freedom, equality, and human dignity. A president had died, but a legend timeless, borderless, eternal was born in the hearts of all humankind. The immortal legacy of Lincoln. When the dust quietly settled over Abraham Lincoln's grave at Oak Ridge Cemetery, one might have thought his story had ended a president who led a nation through civil war, only to fall by an assassin's hand as peace emerged. But in truth, that moment marked the beginning of a new story, one that would never truly end. From the day he was laid to rest, Lincoln began to live on in the memory of the world as an enduring symbol of justice, leadership, and moral courage. It wasn't only Americans who mourned him. Across continents, from Europe to Asia, from scholars to farmers, people began to speak his name with reverence. Lincoln became shorthand for dignity, equality, and compassionate leadership. Students studied him, poets wrote of him, statues were raised, not just in Washington, but across the globe. For over 150 years, whenever America stood at a crossroad, the nation looked back to Lincoln as a moral compass. When freedom was at stake, people asked, what would Lincoln do? When civil rights marches surged through the streets, it was Lincoln's face they held aloft, not a general's, not a king's, but his. In 1963, as Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, he stood at the Lincoln Memorial and began by saying, 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. More than any slogan or law, Lincoln's life became the living definition of democracy, not through authority, but through kindness. He once said, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people." More than a century later, those words remain the heartbeat of every free nation. Lincoln's legacy doesn't lie in monuments. It lives in how the world understands true leadership, not revenge, but forgiveness, not self-glory, but service, not fear, but hope. Every president who came after him has looked to Lincoln not for strategy, but for wisdom, humility, and moral courage. When Barack Obama, the first Black president of the United States, took the oath of office, he placed his hand on Lincoln's Bible. In a world often gripped by turmoil, Lincoln's name remains a guiding light, the North Star of integrity in politics. He was not flawless. He made mistakes, but he never let hatred override reason, nor let power silence his conscience. And perhaps for that reason, above all, he is eternal. You've just experienced the extraordinary life story of Abraham Lincoln, the spiritual father of modern America and one of the greatest icons in global history. Subscribe to Legends of Humanity to continue exploring the lives of legendary individuals from every corner of the world, leaders, scientists, philosophers, artists, and unsung heroes who left an everlasting mark on humanity. Legends of Humanity, where history becomes timeless inspiration.